This week, we'll take a float down the rivers of northern Michigan to learn more about river drives and river hogs on this episode of North Country History. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Hello, and welcome to another episode of North Country History with Rob Berg. Today's episode is going to be a continuation of last week's winter logging, and we're going to be talking today about river drives and river hogs. How is this a continuation of winter logging? It's because the movement of logs down the river in the springtime is what determined how you could cut, where you could cut, and when. And I say how, maybe not really how, but certainly where and when. Because moving the logs the long distance, floating on rivers, meant you had to cut within a few miles of the rivers, particularly at that time prior to railroad transportation. And you had to cut in the wintertime because the best time to move the logs would have been in the spring after the spring melt, after all the snow and ice had melted, the water's running fast and deep in the rivers, and it made it the perfect time to float the buoyant white pine, red pine, and a few other tree species, the logs, down the rivers to the sawmill. So this is why Michigan was a very good location for logging because of the numerous relatively short rivers. Now, in the east, they would have been logging along numerous rivers. In Maine, the Penobscot, the Kennebec, the Machias, among just several rivers, Vermont and New Hampshire, down into Massachusetts, the Connecticut River, and then a number of other rivers they could have logged along. And in New York, the Hudson River coming out of the Adirondack Mountains and down to Albany would have been a perfect river for logging, along with numerous rivers in Pennsylvania, the Allegheny River, the Susquehanna, being just a few. So rivers were very important for the logging industry in the east, and it was natural for the lumbermen as they moved west to the Great Lakes region to continue to look for rivers for transportation of the logs. So it was a complete natural, again, coming to Michigan and finding the numerous rivers. The Saginaw River Valley, with all of its numerous tributaries, the Muskegon River, the Manistee, the Pere Marquette, the AuSable, the Boardman River, all the rivers flowing into the Sheboygan River. In the Upper Peninsula, the Escanaba River, the Menominee River, the Ford, so many more rivers that would have been utilized for lumber. And then in Wisconsin and Minnesota, you had the Fox River, the Wisconsin River, the Chippewa River, the Mississippi River, the St. Croix River, the Rainy River. Just, again, so numerous that I can only name just the biggest ones that come to mind easily. So rivers were natural for the lumber industry. And again, until the railroad came to be to pick up lumber to move the logs in the beginning in the 1870s, the rivers would be the only way to do it. And then even after the railroad, it would continue to be the most economical way to move the logs. So logging in the wintertime, shipping logs floating them down the rivers in the springtime, that was the seasonal aspect of logging. And then in the summer and the fall would have been when the sawmills would have been running at their highest output. Sawmills, if you had enough logs, could continue to operate into the winter season, but until railroads allowed sawmills to get logs year-round, that was even relatively seasonal. So it was kind of a three-part industry: logging, moving the logs by river, and then the sawmill. And then from the sawmill, shipping the finished lumber either on lake schooners across the Great Lakes or on riverboats, barges, taking them along canals and rivers, and eventually the railroad utilizing to be moving the finished lumber long distance, along with, of course, moving the logs to the sawmill. So always it was the transportation that was the development of lumber, of the needs in the industry, how they could easily get the logs out of the forest, how they could easily get the finished lumber to market to the consumers. So as I mentioned, here in Michigan, we have a lot of great rivers. I've mentioned some of them previously, the Black River coming into Lake Huron at Port Huron, or actually going into the St. Clair River just after it empties out of or leaves Lake Huron. You had the Saginaw River and Oliver. It's smaller rivers, namely the Shiawassee and the Tittabawassee, along with their tributaries, the Flint, the Cass, the Bad, the Salt, the Chippewa, the Pine, the Tittabawassee, or I already mentioned the Tittabawassee, the Tobacco, the Molasses, and on and on and on. And then you had the AuSable River as the next major river going north out of on the Lake Huron shore, but also smaller rivers such as Yaw Gray and the Rifle. You had the Thunder Bay River entering into Alpena into Thunder Bay, but it had a number of branches there. The Sheboygan River with the Black, the Pigeon, the Sturgeon, all flowing into the Sheboygan River. Going around, starting on the Lake Michigan side, the Grand River, although it starts down in Jackson County and Lenawee County, it eventually enters the Lake Michigan at Grand Haven, and it does flow through some of the region is pinelands, and was fed by the Rogue River and the Flat River. Those were both major logging rivers. But then you had the Muskegon River, the largest all logging river, or all through the pine forest. The Manistee River, I mentioned, the Pere Marquette, the Boardman River, the Platte, the Betsy. So that's just the lower peninsula rivers. In the upper peninsula, another pine, another black, quite a few pine rivers and black rivers. You have the Escanaba, the Menominee, the Tequamanen, the Ontonagon River in the far west upper peninsula, that fed a large area of logging lands. So these rivers were very, very important to logging and Michigan geography, and it showed why logging was available through most of Michigan. At least where there were pines, you could log because you could reach most of that area by waterway. So that is really why it was such an important part of the logging aspect, was the transportation of them, of the logs by water. Now, not all of these waters were easily used. Your large rivers and tributaries had deep channels with water running very well, but some of them had issues. You had natural obstacles in the upper peninsula. That included waterfalls. Believe it or not, they moved logs down the Tequamanen River going over the upper falls and through the lower falls. I've seen photographs of it when the water is running very high. It's not a very large plunge over the upper falls, but yet it's still covered with logs because so many coming down and they're getting stuck, and a jam at the bottom of the upper falls that had to be broken, probably a lot of it by dynamite. So there are obstacles such as that, and sometimes they altered those obstacles using dynamite to blast out rocks and other obstacles in there, digging new channels, building dams. If the water was low in areas and shallows, you build up water behind it, have a gate in the dam, and that would then allow water to go through as it was deep enough behind it and enough logs, and float the logs down maybe to the next pond and another dam, and then open that, and so on until you got to free-flowing water. Some of these dams were only going to be used once. Maybe they were just built of earth all the way across the channel, with no gate or sluice through there. And when you're ready to go, ready to open it up, just blow that dam and let everything flow through. Sounds like an odd thing and very unlikely, but actually it was quite common on some areas where they were only logging the one time, only needing that waterway once. Most dams ceased to exist after the lumber period. They were either removed as they were impediment to navigation. Some of them were altered, turned into other uses. Hydroelectric dams, some of these small logging dams were used for private lodges, cottages along on popular rivers such as the North Branch of the AuSable River. At Dam 4, if anybody's out there a fly fisherman and knows the AuSable River fishing, that was the site of a fishing lodge that Henry Ford and Edsel Ford once were partners in. They didn't own it, but they owned shares in it. And that was on the site of an old logging dam. After logging, they converted that dam into hydroelectric power to power the lights, the electric dynamo for the lodge there. Unfortunately, that lodge eventually burned down. The dam was torn out as it was no longer necessary. And so it doesn't exist anymore except on a map. There are other dams, however, that were just abandoned. And many of those were washed out eventually due to seasonal flooding. But one or two of them survive. One particular dam called the North Branch Dam, the East Branch Dam. I'm thinking the North Branch of the AuSable, but it was on the East Branch of Big Creek. And there's two big creeks that flow into the AuSable River in different locations near each other in Oscoda County. That's kind of northwest of Mile, or in the one case, west of Mile. But the East Branch Dam on East Branch of Big Creek flows into the North Branch of the AuSable River, as I had already mentioned. And there's a dam high up on that water that was used up into the early 1900s to help maintain the flow of water needed to move logs. And after it stopped being used, and most of the log driving in Michigan ended right around the early 1900s, this dam was abandoned. Most dams, when they abandoned them, they just kind of left them as is, and they just eventually washed out, as I mentioned, from seasonal flooding, storms, and just the erosion of the log or of the earthen banks of the dams. In this case, though, it did not. It was figured to be high enough up on the stream that there was never enough water building up behind it. Plus, it had a sluice gate, and that gate was removed or left open and eventually eroded or fell apart. No one knows exactly what happened, but that continued to allow a flow of water through there. So that lessened any damage of that dam. I know a bit about this dam because while I was the historian at Hartwick Pines Logging Museum, I was tasked to kind of keep an eye on the dam as the Michigan History Center's eyes up north to kind of make sure that it wasn't being damaged by use. It was an area popular of hunting, and the dam was used consistently by hunters and other outdoor recreation people to cross the stream. And it was concerned that it could be worn out. We looked at maybe building a bridge over it, but unfortunately there was no money in this project and nothing ever happened. It's on state forest land, and I last visited a few years ago, and it is still there, but it is still kind of in a area or in a condition that it's slowly eroding, and unless something happens for the positive, it will probably eventually be lost to history. But logging, or moving the logs on the rivers, it needed a lot of assistance this way. Not only to improve the streams, but also manpower. Moving these logs, you couldn't just drop a log in the river and assume it will make its way down to the sawmill in a matter of weeks or a couple of months. Now it might, but there's a lot of a lot of places along the way for impediments. As the water recedes after the spring melt, then some of the logs can get hung up on the shores along the sides. If there's any tree limbs, what's called sweepers, or trees that are partially across the flow of the water, logs can get snagged up on those. And anybody who canoes on any of these rivers up north, they know what the sweepers are. You don't want to get your canoe or kayak caught up on one of those, because you're probably going to end up swimming, because your canoe will get turned over, and only place to go is into the water. Hopefully it's a nice warm day when that happens. But so these sweepers would have to be removed. You'd have to have men working the rivers to make sure that the logs aren't getting hung up. So you hire a crew of what officially were known as river drivers, but they were known colloquially as river hogs, as river pigs, river rats. They were the men that were tasked to move the logs downriver. In last week's episode on winter logging, I talked a little bit about the pay of the men working in the woods, and most of them were making around $1 a day. But working as a river driver brought on dangers. There were risks of injury and of death. There was working in the forest too, but a higher rate of risk moving logs down rivers. You get caught if you fall in the water where there's a lot of logs there. You can break an ankle, leg, if you're in the water and logs come together while you're in your chest, break ribs, crush your lungs, anything that could be serious injury. And of course, you could be killed by those. You could get caught underwater and drowned. So it was certainly dangerous. So instead of getting paid $1 a day or $1.50, the river drivers were usually making about $3 a day. Now, you're not working as long as they are in the woods, where they're going to work 5-6 months if it's a good winter, and it's going to take a while to get the logs out of the forest. In a river drive, you might be working 2 weeks, a month, 2 months maybe at the max. So instead of making $150 for a 5 month job, maybe you're going to be making for 2 months about $120 as you're going to be $120? No, $180. So you're making a little bit better than you would be for that short time. But again, you have to remember the danger of that. And if you're working only a few weeks, you're going to be not making as much money, of course. But they were certainly the men of legend were the river drivers. And they had to be highly skilled. They had to be able to basically dance on the logs. They wore special shoes or boots called caulked boots. And they're a leather boot, usually a high leather boot, almost knee-high, of laced up boots. And on the bottom sole, they would have cleats nailed into the bottom of them. They called them caulks or corks. And it would help them to get a grip on the wet, slippery logs to help keep them balanced a little bit more on there. Tools that they were using were usually one of two kinds. The most visible one was a pike pole, which could be an 8 to 12 foot long pole with a nice piked on the end of it with a point and then the back curl on it. So you could push and pull logs with that tool, help to kind of push them around in the water. And while you're on the logs, the nice long length could help to be used as a counterbalance to help keep you from falling off the logs, losing your balance there. The other tool that was used commonly was called the Peavey pole. Now, the Peavey pole was an adaptation of two tools, and it was developed most likely by a blacksmith in Bangor, Maine, by the name of Joseph Peavey. And Joseph Peavey, he observed river drivers on the Penobscot River as the log drive coming down Bangor from farther up the Penobscot, and Bangor was at the height of where the river navigation on the Penobscot River. So that was where they could start loading logs into the schooners to be taken down to the Atlantic coast. But Peavey saw these men handling both a cant hook, which was commonly used in the forest, and it was about a 6-foot-long pole with a snub nose on it and then a swinging hook on it, and that was used to latch onto logs to help turn them or cant them on the ground. But you could also use them while you're on the log drives too, to help kind of unhook logs that are getting caught up on a log jam. And so that was one tool that many were using. A second one was called a jam pike. And it was like the pike pole, but shorter, like the length of a cant hook, about 4 to 6 foot long, and just had a point on the end of it. No hook on it, and either a curled back one like on a pike, or the hook that's on a cant hook, a swinging hook on there. So he realized what he could do, because he saw them difficultly using one tool, but needing then to switch to another one, and it was time consuming, it was troublesome. You could easily drop one of your tools or both of them down into the river, and they'd end up with the weight of the steel on them at the bottom of the river. That would be difficult to recover. So he took a jam pike, or jam pole, and then he took a cant hook, and he combined the best of both of them, and put the hook of the cant hook onto the jam pole, and voila, he created the Peavey pole. And either he named it after himself, or it was just being known as a Peavey pole because he invented it. Unfortunately, Joe Peavey did not patent it, so he did not make a whole lot of money on it himself, except for the ones that he manufactured directly. But it became known as the Peavey pole, and it was used not just in New England, but all through lumber regions. Wherever there was logging, there were Peavey poles used. And so Joe Peavey might not have been become wealthy based on his tool, but he certainly revolutionized the logging industry. So the river drivers were using these pieces of equipment to help keep logs from getting caught up in what's called a log jam. And unfortunately, no matter how hard they tried, log jams were inevitable because you had the logs coming together, particularly in areas along banks where they might have shallows, or around curves, and just the way the current takes the logs are going to hit them, and you're going to have them tied up. Now, most of your log jams were not all that serious. It took, a few minutes, half hour to break them loose, and they could keep moving the logs down. But some of your most serious jams would back up logs for days and weeks at a time. One jam on the Grand River in the 1880s backed up logs a good portion of the Grand River from about halfway between Grand Rapids and Grand Haven, and going all the way back up into the city of Grand Rapids, where the jam got so big that it took out several bridges that were crossing the Grand River in the city of Grand Rapids. And that was certainly the worst jam of all that we ever had in Michigan. But they were quite common. And some of your worst jams, the only way to break those loose would be to start pulling logs out one at a time. The idea was always to find that quote-unquote key log, that you break that one out of there, everything else will come behind it. But usually a jam had not just one key log, but several, maybe dozens of them. And you pull one out, you get a little bit of the flow of water coming through, and that'll help push out more logs. But then there's other areas that you're still going to have to break loose. And manpower was the way to break most of these jams. But sometimes, no matter how many men you had on your crews, you could not get that done. So your next option was to bring in horses. And bringing in the horses meant that you would have them up along on the riverbanks, or maybe down along in just the shallow part of the water. and you'd have long ropes or chains going from the horses, from their reins. They're hooked as teams together. So with their tacking, I don't know all the terms of that, but where they're hooked together, as you would for pulling a wagon or a sleigh. And you're going to have long chains and ropes on there, and they're hooked to these big log tongs that were used to hook onto a log or a couple of logs, and you just have the horses pull. And again, you've got these big draft horses, some of them upwards of 1,000 to almost 2,000 pounds apiece. So you've got large teams. Now, that was rare, of course, having them that extreme largeness of 2,000 pounds, but there were a few. And you just tried to pull that log through just by brute force. So if that worked, those logs could get to be pulled through. And of course, there's men using their cant hooks, their Peaveys, their their pike poles, and sometimes using axes and saws to cut logs loose, cut them maybe shorter pieces so they could maybe get them out of there better. And they work their way through, and if they're lucky, they get that jam broken and the water starts flowing free and starts pushing the logs again. The men get back to work of running that log drive and keep floating them down the river. But that didn't always work either. So the final option was, I mentioned dynamite for blowing out impediments in the river. Well, now that impediment are the logs themselves. And so, again, you're going to try to find that key log or key logs, and you're going to have your best men there who are fast. They can run on those logs very easily and with good balance, and they're going to work that dynamite into the places there and hopefully have a long enough fuse that they can get off those logs and get to safety before the dynamite blows. And when that does, everybody has to look out, because you have a rain of log splinters, of large chunks of wood, all flying up through the air, and it could be deadly. And so this was something that was the last resort, because not only don't really want to risk the men, although, gotta say, the men are replaceable. You can find more river drivers, but that lumber is valuable. And the value of that lumber, it was by the board feet, 1 square foot board by 1 inch thick. And you could have thousands of board feet lost by trying to break that jam. And 1,000 board feet generally was worth about $2 to $6. So it adds up when you're talking not thousands of board feet, but millions, and in a logging season, billions of board feet. So you don't want to lose any of that money if you can't. And again, of course, I mentioned it is dangerous. So you break that jam, you get the logs down there to the rivers, and there's a few other things that you have to worry about. And that would be one that was loss of the lumber. It might be natural circumstances, the log sitting in the water for a while, even the most buoyant white pine can get waterlogged and sink. And you're going to lose some that way. And this is why and also get snagged up on the sides of the river. And so you had what was called sacking crews that would kind of follow along behind the river drive, and usually maybe a week or two after the drive's completed, and to try to clear up anything that's been lost or kind of got stuck along the side, abandoned, and get those back in the river and make a little bit more money that way. And the way you could identify your logs as they got to the rivers and finding them, or got to the sawmills and finding them along the river, was with special marks into the logs, what we call log marks. And the end of the log is where you would stamp them in. They used a hammer that was cast in a foundry, and all of the hammers had a particular design that was specific and unique to the logging company that you worked for. And many logging companies had several designs, so they could register them in different counties that they were working and utilizing them in different areas that they might be logging. So the Salling-Hansen Company on the AuSable River would have one mark, SHCO, Salling-Hansen, and then CO for company. And then when they were working down the Manistee River, they had another one that was RH and a pine tree, Rasmus Hansen pine. But they could be interchangeable in different areas, but they were registered to the Salling-Hansen Company, these two different marks. A subsidiary or a partnership of the Salling-Hansen Company was the Michelson-Hansen Company, because Salling-Hansen Company had Ernest Salling, Nels Michelson, and Rasmus Hansen as the three major owners. So Michelson was the president of the Michelson-Hansen Company, and so his name was at the top of the name. And they also utilized some of the same rivers that the Salling-Hansen Company did. And of course, it all ended up in the pockets of most of the same men. They had different shareholders, but for the most part, they were just kind of under the umbrella of the same company. But they had different marks, so they knew where the money would go to for accounting purposes, etc. But sometimes you might have a few nefarious men that would be opportunistic and might be trying to make a buck here and there by, we'll say, appropriating the logs of another company. Okay, it was theft. And these men were nicknamed log pirates. And like the stories of Paul Bunyan, log pirates stealing logs is a great exaggeration, kind of built into tall tales, into myths of logging. It was once said that this was something that happened all of the time on all of the rivers. But there were a few different problems with that. First of all, most of these men were not independent operators, because you had to be able to sell the logs in the sawmills. And to do that, you had to have a mark on the logs, which means you had to have a registered mark. So you worked for another logging company, and otherwise they would get paid for the logs you steal. And you wouldn't really want that to happen. So you had to be working for that company. And that company had to pretty much be, if not outright knowledgeable of your actions, they were certainly looking the other way. So that, what we don't know won't hurt us type of thing. But if you were working for one of the companies that was a competitor of the Salling-Hansen Company, then and you were caught trying to steal the logs of the Salling-Hansen Company, not only were you up for a beating by the crews of the Salling-Hansen river drivers, but then the company you worked for would be responsible for the payment of all that lost lumber. And how are you going to prove that you only stole 10 logs when they'll say that we are missing, 150 logs in this section of the river? Now, most of them underwater as from river drives, or they're hung up on dry banks where it's impossible to get them back into the water. So you're going to write that off as a loss. But if you can prove that they stole logs, well, you can get them for all of the logs that you've lost and say they stole all of these, and then they're responsible for it. Your company is not going to be too happy about that, because instead of making them a few extra dollars, now you've lost them a fair amount of money. So it just was not economical. And to be a log pirate, you'd have to be very stealth-like to be able to get this job done, because you'd have to do it when there's nobody else around. Because if you're working crew and other crews are around, they're going to see you have a few tools that are not likely to be needed for most of the river drives. Now, I mentioned saws and axes to try to break a large jam. They would need them in those special instances, but not generally a tool that you're going to bring on a river drive, especially if you're a sacking crew trying to just recover individual logs as opposed to breaking a jam. So you have a saw, you have an axe, you have marking hammers. They're going to be noticeable. But if you're going to try to steal logs and you need to remark the log, you're going to have to find that log. You're going to have to remove the end of the log and then mark it with a new marking hammer. And that's going to take time, and it's going to be suspicious if you're caught doing this, because you're going to get that log out of the water. if you ever get a chance to, find a log, put it in the water, and then try to cut it while it's bobbing in the water. And I don't mean using a chainsaw. I mean using a 2-man crosscut saw, one that's 4 to 6 feet long or in length, to make it even more challenging. And you can see just how difficult it's going to be. So you find that it's a very difficult thing. And the last reason why we know this has been exaggerated quite a bit is where people would find the ends of the logs that were supposedly removed, what had become to be known as log dollars or wooden nickels or cookies. The slices there where the mark is on it, they were found at the sites of the old sawmills, because once they were registered in there at the mill, they cut uniform lengths. And so if your log, you've registered it as a 12-foot log, but it comes in at 12 foot 6 inches, that's an uneven length. You don't want to have 12.5-foot long boards. They all want to be an even length. So you're going to cut off that 6 inches, maybe 3 inches off each end, or just 3 inches off one end, or 6 inches off one end, and they're gonna discard those. They usually go into the sawdust pile, and all of that at the sawmill would be burned into for energy to more heat, to heat the water in the boilers in the sawmill and the steam engine. And so that would kind of be reused, but some of them weren't. Some of them were left in these piles and they never got to them. There used to be a huge sawdust pile in the city of Sheboygan, in Sheboygan, Michigan, up on Lake Michigan. And eventually, they removed that pile of sawdust because they never burned it all. The mills were shut down, and it just sat there. And it's kind of an environmental hazard, so they cleaned it up, and there were found a lot of these old wooden nickels with the slices with the log marks in them. So that was something that was very, very common. But for some people, not realizing the history of it, they started to just kind of put together these thoughts, and being retold and retold, it became, air quotes here, fact that, people stole the logs and this was them getting rid of the evidence. But not quite as common as was once believed, but certainly did happen now and then. But remember, if you're going to risk it, you may get beaten to an inch of your life, and the result will also be the loss of a lot of money to the logging company that you worked for. So think, before you commit the crime, of what your consequences might be. So you get the logs down there to the sawmills, and they're going to have to be put into different pens for each company, so they could be determined who's going to make the money off of these. And that's where the log mark comes into place. And they would separate them and put them in the different log pens there. And it could be for one sawmill. It could be for multiple sawmills. In a place like Saginaw, Bay City, as I mentioned last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, that there were 120 sawmills in between Saginaw and Bay City. Along the Muskegon Lake, there were upwards of around 50 sawmills there, so highly concentrated on the sawmills. There were lesser amounts at the mouths of the AuSable River at Oscoda and AuSable, but that's where the logs floating down the AuSable River would make it, and they would still have a lot of pens there that they would have to separate the logs and for the various mills. So they were put that way, and it could then easily be determined then who's going to get the payment for that. Oh, and also in some rivers, such as on the Tittabawassee, they had a booming company. Instead of having each company moving the logs, their own logs separately, the companies would join together in this corporation, and they all took part in moving the logs. And they did maybe crew of one company would work a 20-mile section, then the crew of another company following that. And then when they got down to the log pens, to the main boom, that's when they had the various ones working, and they would separate the logs that way. And that way that cut down on a lot of the competition, because the first company to get their logs to the sawmill is going to make the most money. Always the first logs, or whatever you're doing in cattle ranching, the first herds that made it to the railheads, they're the ones that made the most money. Watch any old Western movie, particularly a John Wayne movie. Red River is a great one. And you're going to learn about that in that case. So these, it's the same thing in lumber. Getting the logs, the first ones to the mills, are the ones that are going to make the most money. And so this cut out that competition, and it was all kind of shared through there. Because the logs were all mixed together on that coming down the river, then there was no concern about one company blocking the river, purposely taking a longer time to back up the logs behind them from other companies. So they're down to the rivers. Logs have been separated. The season has officially ended. Men who want to work in the mills go to work in the mills. Those who are going home to the farms or to other work, they're doing that. But you've just worked this long, hard river drive. I say long again, it was respective to whatever length of the river they're on. But it could be a couple of weeks, it could be a couple of months. But they want to blow off steam, and they've all been paid. Some companies, when they're in the forest, they would pay the men monthly, but on a river drive, there's nothing to spend money on while you're working the rivers. You also work 7 days a week on a river drive. There was no day off because that river doesn't stop on Sundays, so neither do you. So by the time you're down there to Bay City, we're going to use that one as the great example because it was famous. And you've hit the town, and Bay City had Hell's Half Acre. And that was the whole strip there along Front Street, along the river, along the Saginaw River there. And it was filled with saloons, with brothels, with gambling halls, and boarding houses, everything that was needed to make, or to basically take money from the shanty boy, or from the river drivers, the river hogs. And so they were, if you had money in your pocket, you better guard that safely, because you drink a couple of glasses of whiskey that have been doctored, and you pass out, and you're going to get fleeced, and the money is going to be stolen from you. You're going to go into a brothel, and the ladies there, not only are they going to give you a good time, they're also going to make sure that while you're unconscious, you're going to get fleeced again. And some of them just left you there. They dragged you out into the streets, into the alley behind. But there was one section of buildings along in Bay City called the Catacombs. And they had cellars that were interconnected. So you can get from one building to another building because every once in a while, usually when there was a political campaign or an election, and they decided to get tough on the vices there in the communities, and they would raid the places. And this way, both the employees and the customers could escape ahead of the raid. But some of the buildings on Front Street were built out over the Saginaw River, and it is purportedly that some of these establishments had trapdoors. And so you fleeced a lumberjack or a river driver, and he's passed out. And to get rid of the evidence, you throw open that trap door and dump him down into the Saginaw River there. And one of two things happened once you hit that river. You either woke up or you didn't wake up. So there were, on a regular basis, corpses were drug out of the river there. It was a violent, but this was also just part of the blowing off steam, everybody cutting loose. It was just like the Wild West towns again when the cattle drives finished in the towns. And so Michigan and Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ontario, back east, they all had their own versions of this. And it was at the end of the river drive. Majority of them went home unscathed. You might, have less money in your pocket than you started out with because, you did let loose. You did buy new suits of clothing. They gambled a bit. The men also from various drives, various camps. They wanted to show off who was better than the others, and they would have competitions. They could be things like fights, could be fisticuffs, boxing matches, but they could also find a log in the river there and do their the log, what we call log rolling today, or burling, and they would see who was the best ones and who could knock the other one off. And this kind of gave rise to the lumberjack shows that we know of today. So this was all part of this mythology of the river drives. And I say mythology because it's been exaggerated quite a bit, but it is based on fact. And they were usually the toughest and strongest and best men working in the camps, or working, in the job, that would then go out and work the river drives. But not all of them were ones that also worked in the camp. Some of them, that's all they did was work the river drives. But as I mentioned, it was dangerous, and it was also something that was detrimental to their health. You're working a lot in wet, cold conditions, and it's not going to be good for your body. Many of them, had injuries, fractures, broken bones, and then you had arthritis that would set in. You'd have strained ligaments, separated shoulders. So all of the various injuries that, we're susceptible today, but mainly, more so maybe if you're involved in sports. But you're certainly going to see that in the river drives, of all the different injuries that could come across for them. So at the end, it was generally considered a well-deserved, kind of revelry for them. And the good citizens of the communities, they stayed away from those areas and knew that it's going to blow over in a few days, or in a week or so. And the men would move on. They'd be exhausted. They'd be hung. Their hangovers would end. They'd have no more money, and they'd go on home. So that just was part of the lore of logging, was the blow off at the end of the river drive. So river drives were always, as I said, kind of mythologized as this great part of the lumber industry. But they certainly had their bad sides too, and mostly looking at the environmental damage that a river drive did to the river's ecosystems. First of all, you're putting all these logs into the river. The way you're doing that is rolling them down the banks. High banks along a lot of the rivers were a perfect place. You kept the logs up on the top of the banks until spring. And when that water's moving, you're going to just roll the logs down. And that's where they're going to start breaking free them and floating them down. And so on these banks, where these logs are sliding down, rolling down, they were called rollways, log slides, they're going to get eroded quite terribly. All the vegetation is going to be dug out of there. You're going to have furrows down there through the ground. And then when it rains and the snow melt, it's all that water's rushing down through there because nothing's going to impede it to slow it down. And it's going to wash that sand right into the river. So you're going to have not only the bank damage, but the extra sand and silt that will wash into the water there. And the AuSable River, it is kind of an anglicized version of the French words for the Rivière AuSable. I can't pronounce it correctly. I think I've already butchered French earlier episodes, but it was the river of sand. And it was a very sandy bank, and then even the river bottom was very sandy in places. So it just more sand flowing into that water there. And what that would do, it would choke out areas of where insects were hatching. The great hatches for fly fishing on the AuSable River. That could not happen when you had all this sand and silt in the bottom of the river. And along with the beds for where the fish were breeding at, the grayling, the fish that Grayling, Michigan is named for, was native to many of the northern Michigan rivers. And it had a number of reasons why it became extinct or extirpated in Michigan. But one of them was due to the logging industry. It choked out the areas of where they were spawning at. And it made it difficult for the grayling to reproduce. So that was just one of the reasons. Another one was the overfishing. It was just extremely easy to catch those fish. And then when they introduced trout into many of the rivers, which were originally not native to some of the rivers in Michigan, the competition, the grayling was, I guess you could say, a more docile fish, and it lost out to the trout in many ways. But the logging, the river drive, certainly contributed a lot to the loss of the grayling there. So you had the erosion there and all of the soil, the silt, sand going into the river there. And that, along with the more riverbanks being opened up to sun, the trees being cut, the sun beating down, along with more solids in the water, that the rivers warmed more than they had been before. Our rivers in northern Michigan are cold water rivers. In fact, most of our rivers in Michigan are cold water. I live not far from the Huron River down here in southeastern Michigan, and that too is a relatively cold river. Cold compared to outside of the northern areas, not as cold as maybe the AuSable River. I was up in the AuSable at the beginning of August, and normally at that time, it's a very swimmable river. Oh, it was still very cold, and it was breathtaking when I took a dip in that river. So these rivers, once you add extra sunlight, extra sand and silt in there, that will allow more absorption of heat. And not only is that bad for the fish, but it's in general for all of the aquatic life in the rivers that were not very good. So that was not good, as I mentioned. Plus, wherever you had impediments that were destroyed or were changed or dams put in, that altered the river in even small ways, and that were permanent in many cases. And it wasn't until the 1930s when the Civilian Conservation Corps, as many years as I worked in interpreting the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, I still have a hard time saying it today. But their work of trying to do bank stabilization, they do a lot of cleaning out, and to modern era now, there are silt traps in the river where they will dig out sometimes 10, 12-foot deep pits and let all the sand to settle down in there. And when those pits are full, they dredge them out and allow for more of it to fill in there, and that's a way to remove it out of the rivers. It's an exhaustive process, but it has improved our rivers. To this day now that the AuSable is one of the top fly fishing rivers, trout rivers in North America, and it was where Trout Unlimited was created in the 1950s. So it's part of that very important story is after the logging, the damage to the rivers, and then the slow rebirth of these rivers. So this is something that we're seeing today. The rivers will never be the same as they were prior to the logging and the use of the rivers and the river drives, but they are back to where they're usable. They're popular for fishing, for canoeing, kayaking, now paddle boarding on there, and just great swimming holes in places. You can tell I once lived up there, and I really took heart to loving the river. I'm also blessed to have family, a cousin who lives on the AuSable outside of Grayling, so I can visit him whenever I get up there. So this was all part of the story. You had the importance of the logging and the economical boom of it, but then also the environmental impact. And it was the same out in the forest to the rivers. And we'll see in that we're still dealing with it today in other aspects that we'll talk about on this podcast. One last thing I want to mention is that because the river is showing the importance of this, there's a monument that I want to give a shout out to that's very important for you to visit if you're in Michigan and you're interested in learning more about the logging in the rivers, and that is the Lumberman's Monument on the AuSable River in Iosco County near Lake Huron, and where the river flows down through to Oscoda near the mouth there. There is up a ways, about 20 miles by road from Oscoda, is the Lumberman's Monument. and it was erected in the 1920s, paid for by the lumbermen that were still living or their heirs. And it's a monument to the logging in Michigan. And there's 3 men on the statue. There's a timber cruiser who is looking for the lumber, looking for the trees that they're going to be cut. There's a sawyer, and he's got his crosscut saw up on his shoulder, ready to go out to the woods to cut the trees down. And then there's a river driver with his with his Peavey pole, and he's ready to move those logs down the river. And it's an impressive statue. The site is part of the Huron National Forest, and it overlooks one of the lakes, or one of the ponds that was created when hydroelectric dams were erected on the AuSable River in the early 1900s. And down, there's a large bluff it sits on, and there's stairway down to the river. And at the bottom of the stairway there on the river, there's a recreation of what's called a wanigan. And that was the rafts that were used by the river drivers. I forgot to mention that. They had traveling camps along on the river, and these rafts, which followed along with them, and it had usually a shack or a tent attached to it on the top of it, and it carried their supplies. Some of them had a cook shanty in there, had a not the entire dining table and everything, but an enclosed area where they had the cook stove and the area for them to prepare the meals and to store food. And so they have a recreated one in the down there at the bottom of the river. And once again, it was something I was lucky enough to consult on early in my time at Hartwick Pines. It was 1998. I was still brand new, but one of the planners for the Huron Manistee National Forest came over to Hartwick Pines and wanted to talk to me and look at the exhibits we had for the cook shanty, and to see how they would set up for their kitchen area. And also they had a lot of photos themselves, but we had an even larger collection, so they could look at historic photos. And they really located the wanigan in a perfect place that mimicked a great photograph of a wanigan in on a river drive. In this case, the river was on the Manistee, but they put it on the AuSable. Had a similar scenery in the background, and I'll throw that photo up on YouTube when I put together a little video to go along with this podcast. So again, I'm doing verbal interpretation on something that's even better to be carried over as a visual. So thanks again for listening today. I hope you learned a little bit about the river drives and the river hogs that were involved with it. And you'll be interested to continue on listening to the North Country History with Rob Berg podcast of the Forest History of the Great Lakes. Our next episode, we're going to take a little bit of a shift. I'm done with my little kind of short series here of setting up the logging history of Michigan, and then also the larger extent of the Great Lakes region. And the next episode, we're going to talk about the birth of reforestation. And I went on location in May of this past year to the historic Higgins Lake Nursery and CCC Museum at North Higgins Lake State Park, and at some of the other areas around Grayling, and where we can really consider where reforestation began at the beginning of the 20th century, but there were aspects of it that began even as early as the 1880s. So I'm going to start tackling that with an episode next week. After that, we're going to have different episodes happening. I'm going to have some special guests on a few episodes. And then after I'll wrap up the season with a couple of other location ones. And then next year, we're going to expand more, or next season, I should say, we're going to expand more on further topics into the logging, or into the forest history of the Great Lakes. So right now, we're at about the halfway point of season 1. So thanks for listening. And as always, if you enjoyed what you're hearing, what you like here, please let another person know and introduce them to North Country History. And again, like this, subscribe, download to listen later, anything you can do to help support it, it ensures that I can continue to do this podcast. And you can keep track on YouTube, on Facebook, on Threads, on Instagram, so you can learn more about North Country history with Rob Berg and the forest history of the Great Lakes. Thanks a lot. I'll be talking to you again soon. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.